Hey everybody, it's Curse, and today I wanted to bless you with my potentially a little bit spicy take on Maxroll's freshly released Last Epoch tier list. Tier lists have been a staple in the gaming community for a while now. We've seen all kinds of tier lists, and they've even become a bit of a meme with people making the most random tier lists out there. If you just go search tier list on YouTube, you're going to get some funky results. The first one that showed up to me was a chip tier list, and apparently Doritos suck, I don't know. There is also a vegetable tier list. Tier lists can be fun, entertaining, educational, and enjoyable. So I wanted to discuss with you two different topics regarding the Maxroll tier list specifically today. The first is why I believe that the existence and the publishing of a tier list by Maxroll that is based off of exclusive community tester privilege given to the Maxroll team by EHG is incredibly unhealthy for the player base and the entire ARPG community. And the second is the role of NDAs and content creators within the Last Epoch community and the RPG community in general from a player, developer, and even content creator perspective. But before we jump into the discussion, I want to give it a little bit of context and frame it a bit for everybody just so that it is as productive as possible. I'll start with noting that I'm a fairly new and fairly small content creator, having mostly covered Last Epoch with a heavy focus on build guides and build creation over the last 1 year. So I'm a bit of a niche creator in the community because most of my focus is on endgame optimized builds. So my reach is an absolute joke compared to Maxroll's reach, where between all of their content creators, they have millions of subscribers, billions of views, and a ton of influence within the ARPG space in general. And of course, I'm including the non-Last Epoch creators as well in this description. So given my limited reach, I think I can attempt to approach this issue from the perspective of an ARPG gamer and not necessarily from the perspective of a content creator. At the same time, while my reach is limited and I'm potentially alienating the biggest org in the space that I create content in, which seems like not the best of ideas, but at the end of the day, I'm a Last Epoch fan and I'm a gaming fan first and foremost. So the content creation thing is a hobby, and maybe I'm willing to put myself a little bit in the line of fire if it means improving the games that I love. So I want to make my intent clear. I suspect this video is in the long term a net negative for my channel, but I hope it's a net positive for the gaming community, especially for the Last Epoch community. I also want to put a laser focus on the issue and or action and not on the individuals performing the action. I'm interested in creating a healthy discussion around a specific action or issue that I personally find highly detrimental to the Last Epoch and RPG community, and I want to share my relative stance on the issue as well as learn and maybe assess the relative distribution of stances on the issue within the community. I'm not interested in starting up a witch hunt against Maxroll or in criticizing individuals within the Maxroll team. That seems counterproductive to me, especially given that many of these content creators have contributed significantly to the Last Epoch community over the years. So let's discuss and debate the issue and not the individuals. So now that all of that is out of the way, let's jump in. The first topic that I mentioned is why the tier list that Maxroll created and published is a net loss for the community. I want to define the problem as clearly as possible so nobody gets the wrong idea of the issue I'm trying to raise. The existence of a tier list is totally standard. I mean, I have one myself and it's based off of the current patch and the current meta in Last Epoch. My biggest concern here is with the fact that the tier list includes builds that nobody else has had the opportunity to play other than Maxroll team and other community testers. So why is that an issue? And let's use everybody's favorite Diablo 4 as an example. Right around 2 or 3 days before the game actually launched, around June 3rd or so of 2023, a single content creator came out and published a YouTube video about pretty much the strongest build for Barbarian and the strongest build in the game, period. I'm not going to name the content creator because that's counterproductive and I don't want to, throw anybody under the bus. That's not the point of what we're trying to accomplish here. But what happened with that example is that the entire community knew the relative metagame and the relative top strongest build in the entire game before the game launched. So when the game launched, and here I am as a barb enjoyer, every single barbarian leveled up from 1 to 100 utilizing that whirlwind build. And for me personally, the lack of build diversity at launch for D4 and its resulting state which was completely absent of any creativity whatsoever, was by far the greatest disappointment and turnoff from the game. And sure, that was partly due to poor design, but the leaks that came out from closed beta testers revealing the relative power of every single build in every single class was certainly the nail in the coffin for Diablo 4's build diversity. What should have taken maybe 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 days to arrive at took less than a day. Everybody knew what they should be running, and everybody was running that. If you just went on any of the websites that track the top 100 level progression for barbarians or for any other class, it would take you 3 milliseconds of scrolling through that list of top 100 to realize that there is something incredibly wrong with the game, but also just incredibly wrong with build power in general. And that disappointment in the lack of build diversity was made even worse by the fact that we were deprived of that exploration process of trying builds out, trying skills out, figuring things out on our own, seeing what works, the trial and error process itself. All of that was circumvented by the leaks that came out shortly before the release. And it's also important to note that Blizzard mismanaged the closed beta access and privileges multiple times during that period. They were surprised that the community did not approve of closed beta testers and content creators being allowed to participate in the hardcore first to level 100 race. That was absolutely amazing. Clearly, there was a disconnect between Blizzard's understanding of what their responsibility toward the player base should be and the actual player base's expectations. And this is one of the reasons I'm making this video today. I would love to give to HG more insight into the Last Epoch player base's expectations. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But back to Blizzard here, it was also very ironic given their commitment to safeguarding leaks relating to the D4 storyline and other close guarded secrets. They recognized that the player base finding out certain elements of the game would detract from their enjoyment and their experience of the full release. And this is pretty obvious, right? If you know the full storyline in D4 and they've worked so hard in making it as cool as possible, they don't want it to fully leak out before the game is even released. They want every single player to enjoy it to the fullest extent once the game is out. However, somehow Blizzard did not apply this thought process to other just as sacred once-in-a-lifetime gaming experiences like stumbling through your first build in order to eventually land on something cool or get annoyed at nothing working in your favor and go on YouTube and finding just another content creator to help you out with a tried and tested build. And so now let's go back to Last Epoch and let's draw the parallel between Blizzard and ESG. In the same way that Blizzard have a responsibility to safeguard these once-in-a-lifetime sacred gaming journeys, whether it's through the campaign or through your build creation process, through your character power progression process, they have a responsibility to safeguard those for the player base to enjoy when the game comes out. And ESG have the exact same responsibilities when it comes to Last Epoch. And if we compare the two examples a little bit further, I would even claim that the Maxroll tier list release is, relatively speaking, probably an even worse offense than the D4 example, because the scale of the Maxroll tier list is much larger. With Diablo, it was one content creator revealing the most powerful build in the game casually. But with Maxroll, their intent is to fully disclose and publish the relative power level of every single build in the game. Whether or not they do so accurately or whether or not they manage to discover every single build is irrelevant. It's the intent and the scale of it that is much larger here that I want to highlight. And also with D4, it was a single content creator, and that is much easier to deal with compared to the largest organization in ARPG content creation doing the same thing. And that's because EHG simply cannot afford to alienate Maxroll. It would be foolish and a bad business decision, especially given that they're a brand new studio. They're simply put in a pretty awkward situation. Maxroll is an invaluable partnership for them because of how many eyes and how many potential game sales they bring to the table. But at the end of the day, game review access has been a standard gaming practice for forever, basically, ever since the gaming industry first started up. Large game review companies would get exclusive access to pretty much the entirety of the game code and the gaming experience with the intent that they produce a review for the game. And if those reviews are all favorable, that generally leads to a really good exposure for the developer and for the game, and a lot of sales, obviously. So this is a necessary practice that is part of the gaming infrastructure and should not be taken away. But the problem here is that this game review, or sometimes beta access, has slowly over time devolved into large content creator organizations and individuals leveraging their exclusive closed beta access to not only review the game, but also attempt to review the entire relative power of every single meaningful choice that the player can make. And that's the greatest travesty here. Tier lists like this one deprive the player of choice. Combining a certain set of skills and finding out that it can do most of the things that other skills can do, but it is somewhat mediocre, is a choice that is now no longer available to the player. And that's because we have this massive organization with 5 or more full-time employees working overtime to tell us what the meta is before the game is even released. So I wanted to highlight the distinction here between game review access and what is actually going on with the release of this tier list. Sure, maybe it creates hype and it gets attention to the game, but I would argue it might not be the best kind of attention that the game developers would want. So now that I've shared with you my main concerns with regards to this issue, let's talk about how this issue can be resolved, as well as the incentive structure behind this issue. And we can start by looking at an example of a developer that takes this responsibility of safeguarding the player's experience through their game very seriously. And that is Grinding Gear Games, with Path of Exile specifically. Now, I haven't been fully immersed in the PoE universe over the last 10 years as much as I would have liked, but everything that I have seen so far and everything that I hear from my chat is that they run a very tight ship. And leaks about upcoming patches or seasonal content or balance change implications, and I mean, forget about the full launch of the game, just seasonal content and balance change implications are heavily safeguarded behind NDAs. So this is an example of the issue being recognized, first of all, and then remedied and addressed accordingly. And given that example, simply shrugging our shoulders and hiding behind the inevitability of leaks becomes a less viable stance, in my opinion. Something else that GGG have figured out is that beta testers should not be eligible for subsequent race events at launch. It seems like common sense to me, but according to senior Blizz execs, it isn't as common sense as I thought, so it's probably worth bringing that up as well. But at the end of the day, this serves to reinforce the message that exclusive information that could jeopardize the player base's enjoyment of the game should be heavily safeguarded. And pretty much the only way to do so is through strong NDAs. And I also want to highlight here that we have absolutely no idea as to what the kind of NDA that was signed between EHG and Maxroll. So let's not speculate on that. It's very possible that the Maxroll team are within every single right to do what they did, which is why I would further highlight that we're not here to criticize the individuals, but more so criticize the action. Because the action, while not breaking any rules or doing anything illegal or against any NDA or whatever, it can still be an action that we wish to eliminate out of the possible set of actions that community testers and content creators have. And now let's talk about the relative incentives that every single party involved here has. From a content creator perspective, clearly there's a direct financial incentive to leak everything that they can get away with, essentially. If Maxroll can become the go-to source for Last Epoch, pretty much anything, any kind of content, they will do so. That is because there's a bunch of money on the line if they manage to do so. I hope there is some incentive there for upholding one's reputation as well, but that is probably dwarfed relative to the financial incentive. And also that's an incentive that is very individual dependent and varies from one person to another. When it comes to the dev side, however, incentives are quite a bit harder to disentangle. They probably have an incentive, financial at that, to allow and even maybe push stealth leaks in order to generate hype for the game and thus generate sales and more money, frankly, for the game. And at the end of the day, I want EHG and Last Epoch to succeed. So I want them to do what is right for the game's success. However, it's also important to note that there is an adverse incentive in that if they disappoint too large of a share of their player base with massive leaks, that can be detrimental to the overall success of the game as well. I would probably argue that leaks like this have a positive short-term incentive and a negative long-term incentive. But I could certainly be wrong. Who knows? Now, from a player perspective, we have a variety of types of players, and so incentives can vary. Some players put the highest priority in fulfilling the in-game power fantasy. The journey of becoming more powerful and figuring out how to get more powerful is much less relevant than the outcome of just being powerful. This is why real money trading exists within ARPGs. This is why these tier lists exist, and quite frankly, why a lot of content creation exists in general. And so players like that probably don't care nearly as much about this issue as some others might. And then there are players that value both the journey and the outcome. I probably fall into this category. I enjoy the process of making my own build. I enjoy the process of trial and error, finding out what works for me, given my playstyle, given my preferences. But I also want my build to be powerful. And so in the past, for example, with PoE recently, lacking the knowledge necessary to create my own build, I just went to YouTube and I found the most noob-friendly, strong and interesting looking build that I want to try out. So I'm definitely no stranger in being a consumer in, let's say, tier lists or content that helps me become more powerful and helps me skip parts of the discovery process. But in general, I do think that journey of discovery is sacred and should be protected, especially when it comes to game launches and stuff like that. And I guess my take on this has become stronger because of the awful experience that I had with Blizzard and D4 and all of these leaks. And then there are also players that are fully journey focused. They don't care whether their build is strong. They don't care whether they're fully optimized. They're just enjoying the game itself. Players like that might not even care very much about this whole discussion at all. And so at the end of the day, what I'm trying to highlight here with these different and maybe clashing incentives is that the incentive structure behind content creators and developers and players is complicated. So what is best for one party, what might not be best for another, and that makes remedying the issue that much more complicated as well. But if we identify that currently we are in a state that is undesirable, we can get to a better state by changing the incentive structure. So I'll bring us back to NDAs, and they clearly can change the incentive structures for all the parties involved, right? They give a strong incentive to content creators to abide to the NDAs at the cost of losing their reputation, losing their relationship with the developers, and as a result, actually having a net financial loss. So it is an adverse financial incentive that directly counteracts the positive financial incentive to leak everything as much as possible. So at the end of the day, I do believe that publishing a tier list that includes skills and classes that nobody else has access to, except for an exclusive group of community testers and content creators, I do believe that this is strongly detrimental to the Last Epoch community and player base. And it's quite obvious that it's too late to act on what has already happened. But for future scenarios, let's say patches and whatever, if the community and EHG happen to agree on whether or not this is a problem, I think the best remedy and solution to the problem would be stricter NDAs. And that kind of summarizes my take. And now I want to attempt to steelman the other side as well and just give a few arguments as well as my counter arguments as to what my thought process is around this issue. I'm sure an argument that will come out is going to be, if you don't like it, don't look at it. And you better believe that I'm not looking at the list as much as humanly possible. But at the end of the day, on stream, I got quite a few questions as to what do you think about this in the tier list? What do you think about that in the Maxroll tier list? But this is also the reason why I haven't put up the tier list on the screen throughout this entire video. I don't want to spoil the relative power level of every single skill before we've even seen the patch notes to everybody watching this video. That would also be the wrong action in my humble opinion. And whether or not I look at it, lists like that are highly detrimental in firming up some sort of metagame of what everybody plays. And they will certainly reduce the build diversity for when Last Epoch finally comes out with 1.0 in just under a week now. Another argument that I have heard is that Maxroll are not releasing any unknown info because of the reviews that already showcased all of this class content and skill trees, etc. But that is simply not true. Some of the new shaman skills, we only know 4 or 5 skill nodes within the tree. We haven't seen the entire skill tree. while community testers have, and they have a much better idea of what works and what doesn't. But even beyond information that we have versus they have with regards to skills, having had the opportunity to play the game with these skills and try them out makes a massive difference. Let me give you Hearthstone here as an example. I remember when I used to follow the game, whenever a new expansion was coming up, Blizz would highlight new cards that might be getting released, and then all of the content creators would make a video about what they think is the relative strength of every single card and where they think the card will end up in the meta. And the most fascinating thing there is every time, inevitably, every single content creator got quite a few of the cards absolutely wrong. I always found that hilarious. And the reason for that is even the utmost experts in the field can theory craft and can try and calculate and estimate how something is going to work and how much damage or how much survivability or how much this or that you're going to be able to produce with a certain specification. But without having actually played it out and having tested every single interaction, it is extremely unlikely that you're going to perfectly predict that. Being able to fully test things out, especially when it comes to tricky wordings in a game like Last Epoch, where I've had so many situations where I read a certain skill in some way, but then I test it out and it works in a completely different way. Sometimes it's stronger than I anticipate, and sometimes it's weaker than I anticipate. But all of that results in me completely changing around my build decisions and my build choices. So Maxroll, through the release of this tier list, are leaking a ton of exclusive information. To me, there isn't really much of a question around that. And by far the strongest argument that one could pose in favor of this tier list's existence and publishing and release altogether is that this is what the player base wants. And this is something that I cannot accurately gauge. I can speak for myself in that this is certainly not what I want, but that is also why I'm making this video. I wanted to ask you, the player base, what your thoughts are on this topic and whether or not you think this is an actual problem or you think that it's totally okay and it should continue to exist in the exact same way with the release of 1.1. Should we have full knowledge of the relative power of every single build prior to actually getting to play all of these builds? So I encourage you to please share your thoughts on this, whether you disagree with me or not. I want to see the full spectrum of opinions and of stances on this topic so that we can have an accurate representation of the player base. And it's quite possible that the distribution of the player base's opinions on the topic is different from game to game. Like the EHG player base might have a different stance overall on average versus the Diablo 4 versus the PoE player base. So I think it's important to get away from the highly subjective opinion of a single individual, aka myself, and try and get a more empirical representation of the distribution of the entire player base, because at the end of the day, I think this can be something that EHG could find extremely useful. It is entirely possible that EHG are of the opinion that this is exactly what the player base wants. And if that's not the case, I think it's important to highlight that. And if that turns out to be the case, I'll just simply sit down, be quiet, and continue being a contrarian, meta-defying gamer that I would like to be. And for some closing thoughts, I thought I'd give one more example relating to what the player base might want or might not want. A member of the Maxroll community, a content creator that has a huge following and I have a lot of respect for, posted a video 3-4 days ago in which they highlighted how much they dislike being given free items or free leveling boosts, and how much they value their individual journey through the game, through being able to level from 1 to 100 or whatever, and having to learn everything and every single mechanic on their own. And I think at the core of what they were describing is something that I very much share with that content creator, and that is highly valuing certain parts of the gaming journey. And so I thought it was an interesting juxtaposition that the exact same content creator 2 days later posted a video going over these tier lists that Maxroll posted for Last Epoch's launch. I think it was interesting to note that while they value their own progression and their own individual journey, they are at the same time depriving all other players of that journey. And I think at the bottom of how they rationalize that is that this is what the player base wants. I'm sure that is at the core of how they justify this juxtaposition. I still have infinite respect for this content creator. I love their work. They're absolutely amazing. And that's also why I'm not, naming them, because I don't want to throw any shade. I'm not here to fish for views by putting some other content creator's face on my thumbnail and bashing them into oblivion, I would put that firmly in the not cool category of actions. And having said that, I want to highlight one more time that I don't want to see any blaming or any bashing of individuals, content creator or not, developer or not, and even excessive bashing of organizations. Let's steer clear of that and let's focus on the action at hand and whether or not it should be considered a problematic action. Anyway, I didn't really want to take up time from my 1.0 prep, but unfortunately the patch is right around the corner, so I feel awkward about posting any game-related content that could potentially be obsolete in like a day. And at the same time, I also think it's important to talk about this now rather than 2 days later when the patch is out, and it feels like the leaks are not as groundbreaking as they are today. And I'll wrap this up by saying that I love Last Epoch and I love EHG, and I strongly believe that 1.0 launch is gonna be phenomenal. Take it easy, everybody. ごちそうさまでした。